All right, good afternoon, good evening, everyone who has joined. There's quite a few of you. It's very exciting. Welcome to our webinar this afternoon on clergy compensation when the numbers don't add up. I'm Jean Avison, co-chair of the Committee on Ministry, and with me today are a group of really amazing folks,
Okay,
and
well,
we will hear from
that's,
them.
yeah, that's something I just never
Okay.
considered before, but certainly can um,
Debbie, could you mute
do
everyone for
that.
the time being, please, except me? Thank you. Um, As I say, welcome. If you would please, as you arrive, please share your name of your local church and your role there. That would be great. This afternoon, we are pleased to have a panel of folk that have various
Okay,
different kinds of experiences. I'm sorry, whoever's speaking, could you put yourself on mute, please, so everybody can hear? Thank you. Today is a panel discussion. You won't be hearing my voice very much. Probably a good thing. With me today is a panel that will be, our moderator today is Reverend Roberto Ochoa. Reverend Roberto is part of the Faith Education Innovation and Formation Info Team of the National Study of the United Church of Christ. And he'll be telling you a little bit more about himself, but his portfolio also includes
yep,
working with some small and rural churches. And then our panelists today, unfortunately,
yeah.
Jamie
Well, I'm
Gilmore
not
was,
worried for myself. I just, I
oh,
suspected that, again, I couldn't remember your last name in the middle of everything, and I remembered
okay.
Randy's last name, so um, I just wanted to give a heads up that you're probably going to get a call. Maybe she will, maybe she won't. I don't know, but
I'm sorry, I
Okay,
don't know how to mute everybody.
that's okay. I took care of it.
Thank
Um,
you.
okay, so and but with Reverend Roberto is Becky Martin, the co-chair of CPC Committee on Ministry and also moderator of Ashland UCC. Reverend Jenny Ott, pastor of Lake Oswego UCC in Lake Oswego. Jeff Pratt, a part of the clergy compensation rewrite team and also CPC treasurer and treasurer of his local church, Clackamas UCC. And Reverend David Randall Bodman, pastor of Bethel UCC in Beaverton. So I thank all of these folks for taking their time out to be with us today. And thanks to all of you who sent in questions with your registration. And if you have additional questions to add today, I would invite you to put them in the chat and we will do our best to get to them. We have less than an hour and we want to cover as much ground as possible. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Reverend Roberto Ochoa to get us started. Hi, Roberto.
Thank you, Jean. I really appreciate the invitation to be with you all with this important conversation that we're having. Again, I am the Reverend Roberto Ochoa. Currently, I serve as the UCC Minister for Ethnic Inclusion and Congregational Support for our rural and small town churches in the national setting, in the national ministries of the UCC in Cleveland, Ohio. I'm also the current candidate for conference minister for the Iowa, South Dakota, Nebraska conferences. And so this conversation is really very important to me. I started my ministry at a small membership church before my call to national, where one of the issues was how to compensate pastoring when we had to find ourselves not able to even afford a part-time pastor. And so we found innovative ways of when I was called as pastor on how to negotiate that. It worked for us at that time, which was now about 15 years ago. And I know that this trend is a growing one, and especially hitting our rural and small town ministries. So one thing that we do know is that we don't have all the answers. But the fact that we're talking about it for the sake of the future of the church, and I believe that we lean into the wisdom of the rooms, and I am so excited to be surrounded by a wealth of folks that are struggling with it and are doing this and working for this. So, and how do we consider equitable ways to provide the important the important stewardship of providing for pastoral leadership. So what we're going to do, how we're going to do this is each panelist is going to share a little of their story so that you get to know them. And then we'll go in and we've been receiving questions. And please continue putting your questions out there. Jean is going to help navigate us. She's our navigator for the evening today. And so with that said, I'm going to invite Jenny out to come on and share some of her background with us.
Sure. Thank you, Roberto. I'm Jenny Ott. I'm the pastor at Lake Oswego UCC, and I am on this panel tonight, I think for a few different reasons, but one is that I was part of the team that worked on clergy compensation updates from 2013 up until 2019. So I'm not on the current team, but did the iterations prior to that. I've been in the conference for 14 years. I've been at Lake Oswego that entire time, and have also worked with our congregation in particular in my first 5 years, 5 or 6 years, as we went through revisions in 2013, 2014, our church worked over a series of 5 years or so to bring my salary up to conference guidelines as well. And so they've worked hard to try to bring that into practice. And I'm just interested in this conversation as it's something that I've worked on myself, obviously. And we also at Lake Oswego are trying to figure out if we have the capacity to expand our staff at all and what that would look like as well. And understanding we've got to be creative in how that would happen. So that's a little bit of my background. And I should say our church is around 130 members, and we're in Metro Portland.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you so much for sharing that. And now we're going to invite Reverend David Randall to share.
Thank you, Roberto. So like Jenny, I was on the team that created the clergy compensation in the previous iteration. So we are both keenly aware of issues that came up in 2013, and many of those issues remain. I would, if I'm thinking about my church, I would say one of the things that was a shifting point for us was in 2008, when the economy crashed and we were running a huge deficit. And it was one of those moments where I had to do the best I could to speak the truth in love and say, if we keep doing things the same way we're doing them, we're not going to survive. And so we need to do something, and we need to try something. And we actually tried some strategic planning with a tool from the Alban Institute. And that worked for us. I don't think it would work for everybody, but that was sort of a turning point for our congregation. I've been at Bethel since 2003. That means 21 years for those of you whose math isn't terrific. And I've been in the conference that long. And Bethel Congregational Church is in Beaverton, which is a suburb of Portland. And our membership is about 225. And thank you for being here. And these are important conversations with no clear, easy answers, but it's good to try to have an opportunity to talk about them.
Thank you so much, David, Reverend David. And so what I would like to invite is Becky Martin to come in because she works for Community Ministries, and and she, I think, probably has a lot of exposure to some of the questions that seem to come our way. Hi, Becky. How are you doing today?
Very good, thank you. Yeah, I'm Becky Martin, and I live in Ashland, Oregon, Southern Oregon. I've been in the Ashland Church for over 40 years, and when I joined, it had about 30 members, and we were a mission church of Eugene and the conference together, helping us get on our feet. And we did, and now we are in the process of calling a new pastor, having just had an interim, and have a congregation of about 130. And so I've had that local church experience, and then as Roberto said, the Committee on Ministry, I certainly see churches struggling with what kind of pastor, what amount of pastor they can afford to have, and how to be creative about that. So I'm really interested in the conversation.
Thank you so much, Becky. I really appreciate the work you all do in Community Ministries. In fact, I appreciate all our volunteers that work, to, especially in the search and call process, and looking for pastoral leadership. I really honor all of that. And who I definitely honor are those that are called to figure out finances and how to figure out how to make the dollars work. Sometimes when it doesn't make sense. And so I'm going to invite Jeff Pratt to come forward and share his story.
There you go. Oh, thanks, Roberto. I'm Jeff Pratt. I'm currently the conference treasurer, which has its own little uniquenesses about it. But I've been treasurer at Clackamas UCC on and off since about 1988 or so. So Clackamas has grown in these last few years. When I started being treasurer there, we were around 30 members. And now this year we just broke 111. So I've been treasurer of a little church and a not so little church. And so I guess I've seen both extremes. And other than that, that's what I have.
I appreciate that so much, Jeff. And so, some of the questions, we've received several questions about what you all wanted to hear for our conversation. And so from our folks that have on the panel who have worked with coming up with compensation guidelines, that seems to be that comes out every year. Every conference has these compensation guidelines. And I think there's questions are, especially from those that feel like these are not within their reach. Have you heard of alternatives to clergy compensation other than cutting pastor hours? Have you heard of any of those kind of ideas that may have come your way in considering developing, packages for pastors? And I'm just going to open up to our panel.
I would say the main one I know is not less cutting of hours, but more the idea of additional vacation time or a Sunday off here and there, that equating the time and money has been one of the ways to kind of balance out without necessarily having to reduce from full-time to part-time, but just coming up with an agreement, a quarterly weekend off or something along those lines that would feel good to the minister and also still make it possible for the church to honor the package.
David, Becky, Jeff.
Yeah, I would say, and this is kind of a smaller thing, but and not so true for me now that I'm almost 65, but when I was a younger man, it appealed to me to have a gym membership be part of how the church compensated me. And so that's one thing to think of. But I'm with Jenny. Between having extra vacation time and sabbatical time, those are really, really significant in terms of recharging and equipping pastors to be leaders in their congregations. So yeah, I would say those are that's the two that come to mind.
I'm just wondering though, how does that impact, finding people or folks to fill the pulpit while when you have extra time off or fill the roles? Is that building the budget, or do volunteers step forward? How does more time off work, for the church? Just wondering.
Well, our church does budget for pastoral or pulpit supply while I'm on vacation. So it is budgeted, but it's, for example, there was a challenge this summer when I was on sabbatical, and one of the members of our church just stepped up and said, well, I can create a sermon. And so it was a volunteer, and she was not paid. And I'm a firm believer that everybody has at least one sermon in them.
Amen.
And I continue to encourage lay people. And we're doing more with having people share their testimonies and talk, and that seems to equip people and help them feel like, oh, you know, I can actually have a voice in worship. So I think encouraging lay people to do that. It doesn't have to be a sermon. It could be telling a story of their life that's significant in how it connects with their faith. So yeah, that's a quick answer.
What do you think, Becky?
Well, when we were really broke in the 80s, our pastor at that time had a workshop for interested people. And I think about 6 people took her workshop on writing a sermon, and that, you know, then they agreed to volunteer to do the sermon when she had the Sunday off. So it that was creative and inexpensive.
But, you know, the concept of stewardship, you know, and stewardship is more than tithing or giving, right? Stewardship includes of giving time and talent, you know, and so this is a form of in-kind services that the laity can do for their church, in giving their time and talent and of a sermon, like like David says, everyone has one, you know, and maybe this is something that may encourage a future car involvement. What do you think, Jenny?
Yeah, I would echo what David shared about using the lay people in your church, or if you happen to have any retired clergy in your pews, they're often willing to step up and assist. I also think, especially now with the technology, there's a lot of resources accessible online. And so if you're in a church that has technological resources, for example, we've used the CPC produced those contemplative practice videos for Lent a couple years ago. We've used those in place of a sermon. And there's other, you know, there's a lot of resources like on that. The UCC as a national body often will produce a sermon for a special Giving Sunday or a Pentecost sermon or something like that. So there's a lot of those that you know, the worship team can use, or an administrator could help set that up. So it's not always on the work of the pastor to do that as well. So I think that's an option. And I think we've done some creative series at the church too, where we'll do a different style of worship, a turn to your neighbor kind of conversations that again don't require some prep, but it doesn't require a sermon. And so doing some of those more interactive types of services can help alleviate that of having to get a guest preacher. We also have a small budget for one as well, but we use a lot of in-house people. And the other thing I was going to just mention, Becky, when you mentioned the workshops, I know for us with our musicians, sometimes we will give them the use of the space, like the use of the sanctuary, to have their own lessons. So another option might be, I haven't tried this, but thinking outside the box of a church letting a pastor have use of the space, the technology, if they have an avocation outside of ministry, to lead a writing workshop, not necessarily for church people, but for something outside of church, but other creative ways to kind of make up some of that difference.
I hear you. I definitely hear you. Did you have something else to add, Becky?
No.
So Jeff, I'm just curious, you know, so when does the church know, or maybe that there's a time that they need to assess their ability to be able to continue supporting a full-time pastor? What are things that they may need to look into?
I think a lot of information comes forth at budget preparation time.
Mm-hmm.
If you're looking at your next year's budget and you're just get miles apart between what you think your income is going to be and what you need to facilitate your ministry, then you've got some hard choices to make.
And David, when you mentioned that there's sometimes some hard truths, you know, how do you start at least opening that conversation to the congregation of what needs to be done?
Oh, that's a good question. I felt like I didn't have a choice.
Mm-hmm.
I was either something was gonna change, or I was gonna change, or I was gonna go somewhere else, and I was very transparent about it. And you know, it kind of scared people. It scared people into action, and you know, that can't work for everybody. It was gutsy and risky, but it was at a point in my career where I could get away with it. I'm not sure I could get away I know I couldn't get away with it now. But yeah, it was, I don't know, it felt like somebody had to tell the truth. And to be fair, the congregation has to be willing to listen and hear the truth and do something, rather than just feel like, well, that's just the pastor worried about the church.
Any thoughts, Jenny?
Yeah, I mean, as I'm also noticing some of the conversation that's going on in the chat as well. So I might address something in there but I think so one thing Adam Hand wrote another idea about combined worship services, and I think that's another great way. The church I served previously in Minnesota, in July, they would yoke with another church. So one pastor would host 2 of the Sundays and the other pastor would host 2 of the Sundays. And that was a nice way to work together and get to know each other better. And then I noticed the question that the comment about this current discussion is a way to have a pastor working less than 2,200 hours a year. The choices between less hours at a higher wage versus 40 hours a week at a lesser compensation. And I'm wondering, and how much compensation is required for gainful employment. I'm wondering I didn't check the current guidelines, but I feel like the current guidelines suggest 40 to 50 hours is full time, so that the 40 hours a week, I'm not sure if it's stipulated what's part-time, but I think that gets to the question of the next one. Is there a size of a church that would suggest a part-time pastor? So I think that's a question about, as I hear, how do we do less? Or I guess I'm curious for the person asking this question, is 40 hours a week at a lesser compensation? I'm more curious what that question is there.
And yes, and so am I, Jenny. And of course, the dynamics of it all. I mean, one of the things that when we talk about these compensation guidelines, I think it's really important to understand that that's what they are, guidelines, that they are not a one glove fits all kind of situation, because urban settings, small town settings, rural settings, depending on the economic demographics of the community, the outreach, you know, housing costs. Like, we have a question about True. I mean, housing anywhere in the urban setting is almost just like impossible. And yet, you know, and sometimes this is a way for small town rural areas to attract pastors, because housing could be more affordable. And so there's a lot of dynamics to consider. But in the rural and small town spaces, you know, the challenge of looking for pastors that are willing to come to these spaces to pastor. And that's, we mentioned, Jennifer, is that the growing trend of ecumenical pastoring, you know, where small town churches like ELCA and UCC or Presbyterian USA, now many of the United Methodist churches and our disciples, that is beginning, is that to be able to share a pastor, you know, is a great way of not only building communities within the church, but with each other. And I'm seeing that trend now, where they're able to pull the resources to support a pastor ultimately full time. You know, so that's one one idea that in rural and small town settings are. But still, Jeff, you know, when figuring a budget, to David's point, that's where the hard truths are, is to be able to assess, this is what's coming in. This is what's coming in, and we need to work what we have.
Roberto, one of the comments that was just made, Adam Hange put in the chat, not all, but some clergy may want time to pursue other paid opportunities. For example, lead a retreat or a workshop, or perhaps even be bivocational.
Mhm. And bivocational, well, so since I come from an evangelical background, and my first call to ministry was always bivocational, that was my mindset. So some of this conversation was very new to me. But yeah, and we were talking, one of the things is that there are those pastors that this is their second or third career. And often because they retired to do ministry, they received the call for ministry. And so, you know, these folks have different needs than the younger clergy or clergy that are first starting in for full time. So I was a bivocational minister at Lakeview. And so one of the things is that I was bivocational. I had a full-time job. I went to seminary. I got my MDiv, but the church always met my needs. One thing I really always believe that it's been my experience that a rural or small town churches or small membership churches, because they could be in urban suburban areas, will do a lot to support the pastor. But it means thinking out of the box. For instance, you know, some pastors become coaches, for instance, life coaches, or do others like they do therapy, all kinds of locations. So yes, Jean.
The question also came in, and this would be, I'm sure, for the clergy on the panel. Why do congregations need their pastors to work 50 hours a week? This seems overworked toward clergy burnout. Could you speak to that?
I'm gonna let Jenny and Dave start.
Having just read the, I used the sample call agreement from Mesa, and it suggests a full-time job at 40 to 50 hours a week, but with the stipulation that if it continues to be at 50 or over, then we need to have a conversation about workload. And so it sort of recognizes that. But I think professional jobs that are, the person has a lot of discretion over their own time, often run to 50 hours a week in managerial positions where you have some on-call time and some evening meeting, weekend retreats, that kind of thing. So I think it's not unreasonable to think of it as a 40 to 50 hour.
And there's so many layers to that question in the sense of, from ethnic perspective, from my ethnic perspective, is that, the sense of a vocation or a call, whatever profession that may be, is that that there's a tendency of doing 50 hours unconsciously because that's the call. But I think we have learned that how important it needs for pastoral self-care, because the number of folks that burn out when they go beyond, because that, and I think that's been a good thing, is that when we talk about 40 and that 50 hours is pushing it, but 40 hours, is that we also need to understand that our pastoral leadership need to be taken care of, and we can't burn them out.
Yeah, and I would add that it's a two-way street. I think it's it's often joked that it's a walk on water job description, and even when you look at the marks of faithful ministers, which comes out of the UCC, I mean there's a caveat, like, don't assume the minister is going to cover all of these grounds. And I think
Yeah.
that's true for churches, that they have to know that even these job descriptions, which have, I mean, most pastors are generalists where they have to be able to preach and teach and be a nonprofit leader and know HR and be a fundraiser and be able to visit with people and spend time in silence. And, there's all these different capacities. And I think it's, so the church has its own expectations, and then many pastors have their own expectations, which may exceed the expectations that the church has of them too. I mean, and so to me, it comes back to that conversation around what is important to do, because it's important for the clergy to try to hold to that 40 to 50 hours. And it's important for the congregation to hold to that 40 to 50 hours. And that can also be, I think, a real opportunity for a council or a personnel team and a pastor to sit down together and say, what can my priorities be, knowing that I only have 40 hours or I only have 50 hours? Where do you want me to spend my time? And it becomes an invitation to the congregation, because we are the church, and our theology in the UCC is that we are also all ministers of the gospel. And so as a church, we can do some of these things ourselves. So even that question about, is there a size of church that would suggest a part-time pastor? I think so much depends on the particular church, and also what parts the congregation wants to do for themselves, and which part do you need or want the pastor to do as well.
And, to your point, Jenny, I mean, I've always believed that the role of the pastor is to equip the leadership for ministry. I mean, pastors are not called to do everything, or is to equip and use the time that is there, to do either Bible study, worship, is to equip the leadership or to equip the laity to do ministerial leadership within the church, and to edify the word in the church. So I agree with you. That's, and unfortunately, sometimes there's been this focus, this understanding that the pastor is supposed to do everything. Not the case. Jean?
Yeah, just a comment. One of the things that I think might get lost in the panic of not being able to pay a pastor as much as we want them to is the idea that, yes, it needs to be a living wage, and yes, it needs to be fair and equitable, but also it's a covenant, and it's something that I think probably Jenny can speak more clearly about this than I at this point, but you don't have to drink the ocean all at the same time. It can be a partnership to say, we will work, we commit to getting to this place. So Jenny, when you were in your first 5 years at Lake Oswego, how did that work?
Yeah, well, this came about just mostly through conversations. And as I said, I was on the team that did a revision in 2013, which was the first time in 5 years, which I think now, as we try to do that, a major revision as we need to every 5 years. But for me, it started because we had a baby, and my call agreement came with 2 weeks of paid leave. And I remember looking at that and thinking, there's no way that we're going to have a brand new baby and I'm going to be off work for 2 weeks. And so I went to the church. This was before we revised the guidelines, and just started with a conversation around, can we look at this? And does this, how does this feel? And this doesn't feel like enough for me. And can we explore other options? And so it became this open conversation that took us, I'm trying to think, it was probably 6 months or so. We kind of looked at different aspects. And then when the new guidelines came out, there was a significant jump in the grid. We had the grid at that time. And so the church also looked at that and then said, okay, well, we're not there now, but we would like to get here. We can't get there in one fell swoop, but let's try to build into a budget. I can't remember what it was, a certain percentage increase each year over 3 years or 4 years. And so each year they looked at that and tried to tried to match it. And so I'd have to go back to look at exactly, but it was about 3 years or 4 years of incrementally increasing. And then really talking about the, spelling it out to the congregation also as the fair and just, and really trying to honor the work that I was doing, but the work that the clergy, that we rely on the clergy to do. But I think what I appreciate about it was I felt cared for. I mean, even just starting with the parental leave, that was the biggest thing. It's just that mutuality and knowing, oh yes, the congregation and I want to work together and make this work. And so I think that just that orientation to how do we support each other was a big help in that process.
Thank you. Okay. The questions are kind of slowing down in the chat.
So housing is a big one. I mean, but I know it's just something that somehow the benefit package for compensation sometimes is like, I've gone into situations where churches have told me, says, yeah, we could pay the basic compensation rate, but it's those benefits that make it difficult. There's the insurance, the housing allowance, all of those in a market that like you said, earlier, Gene, you spoke about your corporate life, that you work in an agency that had a salary compensation level for urban centers like LA, New York, San Francisco, and then you had others in other areas. And sometimes when considering compensation in our packages, that something needs to be considered is that housing and insurance and all of those issues are different depending on the areas that the churches are. No easy, I don't have the answer for that. I'm going to say right now, I don't have the answer to that, but that says a lot about not only what our churches are doing, but just the state of our economy all over, where the jobs offered out there, housing, the need for just housing or affordable housing is great in our country, or is great in our society.
And for those of you who are looking for that magic moment that we're going to say, we're going to fix this, one of the things that the clergy compensation team hopes to do in the future is take another long look at compensation as it pertains to the housing allowance, and if there are ways that we have missed. And so we're about ready to go onto a deep fact-finding mission to try to figure out if there are any other rubrics or ways of looking at it that remain equitable and fair, but that try to be as clear as possible. And perhaps there will be other ways of looking at our housing that we have missed. And we are first to say that this is an emerging, well, it's not new, but it's something that we continue to learn about and to try to take into account all of the ways that we can turn the prism to look through it to try to get to a place that is equitable and yet realistic at the same time.
I'd like to add to that too, along the same lines. As we do that, the one thing that I have discovered in putting together the tool that we have now, there are a lot more variables than there used to be in the whole question of what is equitable salary, what is equitable housing, and where is the dividing line between the two, and what other aspects should be factored into the mix. So I don't think, I doubt that we'll be able to come up with any one tool that will be a one-size-fit-all solution for every single church. I'm hoping that we can come up with something that'll at least provide some general guidelines and can maybe be customized to suit different churches in some way that is intuitive and possible for them to work with. But that's sort of where my head is at the moment on that.
Yeah. And this is a good time for me to jump in. I just noticed Judy Davis is on this call too, and I'd like to give a shout out to Judy because she was also part of our clergy compensation team, and she did a lot of work, especially around identifying state-specific things that we had been silent about previously. So there are now state-specific guidelines for Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, where before it was just one single thing. So most grateful to you, Judy, and we'll probably be calling you again. So please answer. One question that was just asked in the chat, and it's sort of tangential to the conversation, but it's still meaningful. What honorariums do churches pay for supply pastors or visiting pastors? So instead of asking for popcorn in this setting, if you know what that number is in your church, if you could put it in the chat so we can just see where we're at, that I think that would be really, really helpful, because I know, again, this varies greatly. So I am sorry, Roberto, I didn't mean to jump in.
Exactly. I'm curious too, because like, I know that I get honorariums sometimes. And many times I say, no, I'm your OWCM dollars at work when I visit your church. So you don't have to pay me ever when I'm preaching at your church as national setting. So I'm curious about this, but I do have, one of the things with the compensation guidelines, it seems to impact first calls. The first calls, and I'm just wondering, I'm going to ask Becky, not put you on the spot, but the trends is that when does a committed ministry see a compensation package for a first call for a pastor that may not meet, and one of the for authorization is a fair compensation for a first call. What are the trends that you've seen, Becky?
Well, when I look at the recent MIDs that have gone on through ordination, there's so much alternative ministry that's not parish ministry. So, and then when we look at, is this an ordainable call? That's when we discuss, the compensation. And it has been very, more variable certainly than in the past, but with people taking their first call, really advocating themselves for just doing something different. It might be bivocational. It might be, I have an opportunity to live in this place, and therefore I can afford to do this work that I'm called to do. So it's, and we don't, the Committee on Ministry here does not review all the first calls. So I would have to refer that to the conference minister, but there's certainly lots of alternative paths for ministry that are not just single parish ministries.
Thank you, Becky. Thank you, Becky.
I don't want to minimize the challenges of these questions. I mean, these are all difficult questions, and there's no easy solution to any of them. And it's easy to get bogged down. And I guess one thing I would invite you all to do, because we've been focused on, the how much money do we have kind of, and what can we pay? I would encourage you to think about one thing that you might be able to do differently than you're currently doing. And I'll give you an example. When I was on sabbatical this past summer, I visited probably 8 churches, and not one of those churches, when I walked in, did it feel like they were ready to actually welcome someone new. There was no welcome table. There was nobody there to greet them, greet me. I walked around and people just looked right through me. And I think most of our churches see ourselves as being friendly, and we're friendly to people who are already there. But if there's any way to kind of break the ice with having something that says to people when they when they wander in, hey, we were expecting you to come visit. And if it isn't that, maybe it's, I would say that the biggest thing that's helped Bethel is having a website that's alive. And if you've got limited resources, I would focus on having a website that really tells people who you are. So those are just, I mean, I'm just trying to think what other ways, rather than sort of wringing our hands and thinking, oh, this is all terrible and hard and we can't do it. There might be at least some baby steps that can be taken.
So what I'm hearing, David, which is true, is sometimes is that what type of outreach are we doing? What type of outreach are we doing to make folks welcome and attract them to come to church and give them a purpose to come to church? Because being small-minded is good, but understanding that our ministry is beyond the building, right? And how we welcome folks so that they find a stake in being part of our beloved communities. And of course, and that just matters the more that our ability to come. There are congregations, there are churches that their worship services are still small, but they are so alive in their congregation, is that their congregation is based on all the activities that, the childcare, the youth groups, adult care, doing all kinds of thrift stores, all of that brings in, because they're so engaged in the community, is that their membership may be still small, but they are engaged in the community. But also the sense of, David, I agree with you. I mean, I have been into certain churches that are afraid to say hi. It's like, just like,
Yeah.
well, who are you? But well put. I mean, those are questions that we need to reflect and discern.
Roberto, we have another comment. And there's a question in there, but it was not stated outright.
Mhm.
I have worked at both bigger and smaller congregations. Sometimes the smaller and or rural congregations are more demanding in their expectations of pastoral care and what all the pastor does, because there are fewer human resources available and a higher expectation for pastoral availability. I feel like this might be reconsidered in terms of how we talk about guidelines for pay based on the size of the congregation. I get that the smaller congregation will not be able to pay as much, but it seems like this issue could be part of the discussion.
Thank you so much, Pastor Val, for bringing that up. So true. I mean, what you're saying is, because of my experience with smaller membership churches, as well as in rural and small town, is that because the expectation of being a very relational dynamic is that that sometimes it feels like the expectations are higher because you're the relational part, and that's what they expect. But there's more to that too. There's more to that too that I myself am still developing. So if others could offer their viewpoint, because I also see that in small membership churches is that the laity will also step forward and do a lot of ministry work that sometimes I don't see in larger churches. That will, because of the fact that out of necessity, they will come in and engage and do the work. So it's yeah.
I think that gets back to what you said about part of the call being to equip, a well-equipped laity can fill some of those gaps so that the clergy does have more flexibility.
Oh,
Yes.
question for the Hive. Could someone from a congregation with fewer than 50 members talk about whether they have a full-time or part-time pastor and how they pay for their full or part-time pastor? So I'm not sure who we have on the line today. If you have a smaller church of 50 members or fewer, could you raise your hand? If you could go down to the reactions, there's a heart. You can click on that. You can recognize raised hands, I believe. I'm the host, so I'm seeing a different screen to see, but if you could raise your hand. Okay. Okay, Eric and Corliss, if you all would take yourselves off of mute, and if you could speak to that question, whether you have a full-time pastor or how you pay full or part-time pastor, we'd appreciate your input.
We have, this is Corliss in UCC the Dalles, and I would say we have less than 50 people, active members that come to church on Sunday. We have decided to have a full-time pastor, even with the small membership, and realize that we are just going to go with a full-time pastor and go until the money runs out. Because we want to have a full-time pastor.
Okay, thank you. Eric?
Yeah, we have a new settled pastor, half-time, and we are struggling to make things balance out financially. And kind of along the same lines, we are dipping into our savings basically to keep on a half-time pastor. And we're about 20 to 25 members attending on any given Sunday. And as we grow with our new pastor, we're hoping to reach out to the community more and inform a wider audience of our presence in the community, and hopefully build our attendance.
Eric, what church are you from?
Plymouth Congregational, New Plymouth, Idaho.
Oh, great. Thank you. I appreciate your comment.
Our immediate community is 1,500 population, with the greater area probably 25,000 within 25 miles.
Okay. Thank you. Appreciate your comments.
I really appreciate all the comments in this conversation. I know that this conversation is going to continue, and I'm there to be part of this conversation. I know that I can't wait to meet up with my friend Reverend Tyler Conley to maybe continue finding innovative ways on how to support pastoral leadership. But thank you for the invitation, Jean. Thank you, Jenny and David and Becky and Jeff. This has been a great conversation. Jean, thank you for organizing all of this.
It was my pleasure, and thank you for saying yes. And to all the rest of the panelists, people that I've known for a long time, I am most grateful for your time, and most grateful for all of your time here, all of you who chose to participate with us today. And we hope that we can continue this conversation, and we hope to have a follow-up. First of all, this is being recorded, like the first one, but also we are hoping to be able to have a vehicle by which you could send in questions. So be on the lookout for that. We'll be in communication with you all. But thank you all so much. And we hope to continue this conversation, as we know that the answers are varied and changing, and appreciate your leaning into the conversation all in all. So thanks so much, and we wish you a good evening. Take good care.
Bye-bye.